Tetrodotoxin. It's a paralysing poison which, as you may know, is found in the pufferfish. Almost every year people die in Japan from eating improperly prepared pufferfish, sometimes as a form of suicide. There is no antidote to the poison, and often it paralyses its victims' lungs and hearts before anything can be done to help them. But the pufferfish isn't the only species that contains tetrodotoxin. The same poison is found in the bodies of numerous different creatures, including the blue-ringed octopus of Australia, and in cone snails and newts throughout the world, in Europe, America, and Africa. As if to make the poison even more disturbing than it already is, it's nearly always found in marine creatures, meaning that a person who is poisoned by it has a fair chance of ending up paralysed on a beach. The worst place you can end up paralysed is a deserted beach. Then you'll have a long wait until the tide finally washes over your face, if the poison doesn't kill you first. Worse still is if you happen to suspect that someone poisoned you with tetrodotoxin deliberately. That happy little idea provided me with the inspiration for the following story, which I hope you'll enjoy. By the way, the following story includes characters who have a Bristol accent, which I won't be attempting to replicate myself. I think of Bristolian accents as having a touch of pirate in them, but that may be somewhat wide of the mark. My parents died in a car accident when I was 27 years old. My mother died instantly, thank God, but my father took 2 weeks to die of his injuries. You're not quite the same person after you've watched someone you love die a protracted and wholly unexpected death. At the time, I had no particular direction in life. I had become listless, alienated. The dreams I'd had only a few years earlier had somehow evaporated and turned to a directionless drift amidst a sea of people who all seemed to be getting on with their own lives in a way that I had totally failed to manage. As an only child, it fell to me to sell my parents' house and dispose of all their belongings. The process took a year, and by the time I had finished, I was in a deep depression. I had worked out detailed plans for suicide. I knew precisely how I was going to exit the stage. I only hadn't picked the moment yet. Then one morning I woke up and the sun was shining in the sky, and I said to myself, "Oscar, you need to pull yourself together. You're not even 30 years old and you've got a big pile of cash. Fix your life." Honestly, I don't know what changed in me at that moment, except the whole business of sorting out my parents' stuff was finally over. For the past year, every time the sun shone, I'd look at it and think to myself that I ought to go outside and walk or meet someone. But then I'd give up the internal struggle and carry on lying on my sofa, and the fact that it was sunny outside would make me feel even more depressed than I had to start with. That was the first time in a year that I'd looked at the sun and actually felt like sunshine was a good thing. It seemed to me that I needed a total change. So with the money I'd inherited off my parents, I went to Lisbon and rented myself a little apartment there. And yet, still the clouds hanging over me didn't completely lift. I'd walk around the town in the evening when it was tolerably cool, and I'd look at all the people enjoying themselves and feel detached from it all, and rather depressed. I've never really found it an easy job making new friends, and perhaps I'd bitten off more than I could chew, renting a place somewhere where I didn't even speak the language. One evening I decided to go to a bar I often walked past alone, have a couple of drinks and watch the sea for a bit. I was ordering at the bar when I realised the girl standing at the bar next to me had a Bristol accent, much like my own. I said to her, "Oh, you're from Bristol?" "No disguising it," she said. "You too?" "Bristol born and bred," I replied. "How funny, you go halfway across the world only to run into a fellow Bristolian." She laughed. "There's literally no escape," she said. "My name's Oscar," I said. "I'm Anna," she said. "I've seen you around here before. Do you live here?" "I rented a place here a month ago," I said. "We're sharing a place just up the hill," she said. motioning towards her 4 friends who were sitting at a table. "Come and join us for a drink." At the time, this all seemed a gift from Providence. She introduced me to her friends. There was Archie, a marine biologist who was working at the university. He had long brownish hair, thick glasses, and seemed the quietest of the 4. Jude described himself as an importer and exporter, whatever that meant. He was wearing a stupid hat, one of those pork pie things, but I tried not to hold it against him. He was evidently a bit of a joker and seemed to be the centre of attention most of the time. Taya had sandy-coloured hair, freckles, and arms filled with all kinds of crazy tattoos, and she said she worked as a translator, as did Anna. Finally, there was Ollie, who was half Portuguese and half British. He had a thick brown beard and told me he worked as a chef at a local restaurant. Ollie and Taya seemed to spend a lot of time flirting. I wasn't sure if they were actually together or not. We chatted about Portugal, about the UK, and about a bunch of silly things. After a couple of beers, I felt like I'd known them for months, although in reality, of course, I knew very little about them. It caught me by surprise when Jude said suddenly, "Hey, soon we'll be drinking beer on El Caracol." "Not me," said Archie. "Oh yes, I forgot you're leaving us," said Jude. "Not by choice," said Archie. "His father's been taken ill," Jude said to me. "He's flying back to the UK tomorrow, just when we've got the holiday of a lifetime planned." "Sorry to hear," I said. This talk of someone's father being ill brought back unpleasant memories that I'd managed to push to the back of my mind. The thing that ran through my head, apart from that, was that it sounded like they were all going somewhere, and I just didn't feel like being alone anymore. "We're going to rough it for a week on a paradise island," said Jude. "It's going to be amazing. Don't worry, Archie, we'll show you the photos so you can see what you've missed." "You really are a bastard," said Archie with a laugh. "Where is this place?" I asked, "and when are you going?" "El Caracol," said Jude, with mock solemnity, "is one of the world's most beautiful islands, just off the Moroccan coast, and we're all going there on Tuesday." "That's amazing," I said. "How do you happen to know about it?" Jude tapped the side of his nose drunkenly. "The owner is a friend of my uncle," he said. "I'm not really sure about the whole thing," said Anna. "Come on, Anna, you need to live a little," said Ollie. "Yeah, Anna," said Taya. "Let other people translate things for a while. The way you're going to translate everything, and there'll be nothing left for anyone else." "I've said I'm coming," said Anna, smiling. "Hey," said Archie suddenly. "What?" said almost everyone else at the same time. "Why doesn't Oscar take my ticket?" he said. "Genius," said Jude. "It's the obvious solution." "Oscar, I booked a return ticket down to Guelmim before my father got ill. Why don't you go to El Caracol instead of me?" I stuttered, not knowing what to say. "You can give me 30 quid for the ticket and we'll call it quits," said Archie. "I'm not sure," I said. "Come on, Oscar," said Jude. "You'll fit right in. I can see it now. It'll be a blast." Then, somehow, they all began to chant my name. Oscar, Oscar. Alcohol, it has to be said, played a significant part in all this. But not only alcohol, I was eventually to realise. There was never any real question as to whether I'd take them up on the proposition or not. I didn't want to spend any more time alone. "Okay," I said, "count me in." A few days later, we flew to a small airport in the south of Morocco. From there we drove to the coast. The land round there was like nothing I've really seen before. We wound through sandy hills covered with scrubby, unusually sparse vegetation. Buildings were infrequent outside of the towns, and themselves low and sandy coloured, as if they had been sculpted out of sand. It was as if someone had taken a bunch of sandy south-facing hills from near the coast in Portugal and made an entire country out of them. That was my initial impression, at least. I would have liked to have stopped and explored since I had never been out of Europe before, but Jude insisted we had to make haste. "On the way back we'll see a lot more of Morocco," said Jude. "I'll show you Marrakesh, you'll love it." At the coast we pulled up to a harbour surrounded by a smattering of white stone buildings and more sandy coloured houses. A small but elaborate mosque stood prominently a little way back from the shore. In the harbour, expensive yachts mixed with rusty fishing boats. We ate lunch in a little restaurant where the enthusiastic owner served us a kind of fish stew and flatbreads. It was oppressively hot. After that we smoked Turkish pipes for an hour or so till Jude said it was time to depart by boat. "Do you get seasick?" Anna asked me. "I have no idea," I replied. "Ollie gets horribly sick," said Taya. "I have to have travel sickness pills," said Ollie, holding up a packet of pink pills. "Would you like one?" "I'll chance it without," I said. "It's about 7 hours," said Jude. "It will be dark by the time we get there." "How can they find it in the dark?" I asked. "Centuries of practice," said Jude. We made our way to the harbour where we were greeted by two men with short beards, wearing worn but modern clothing. "This is Omar and Abad," said Jude. "They know the waters here like the backs of their own hands." Omar smiled broadly, revealing white, even teeth, and nodded at us. Abad was busy doing something with the rope that fastened the boat to the land. I was a bit shocked by the appearance of the boat. I suppose I expected something bigger for what to me sounded like a long journey. It was nothing but a small fishing boat with an outboard motor. Spare cans of fuel were stacked in the back. There was really only just enough room for the four of us, together with Omar and Abad. I had brought over €1,000 with me, as recommended by Jude. He said we could make a profit by buying diamonds in Morocco and selling them in Portugal. He had tried to persuade me to take even more money, but I was worried about getting robbed. The thought of taking all that money with me on a boat that looked as though a good wave might easily tip it over wasn't pleasant, but at least I had the cash in a money belt and not in my backpack. "This is the life," said Jude once we got underway. We were bouncing through the waves at a tremendous pace, the scorching sun making the blue water glitter so brightly that without sunglasses it would have been painful to look at. "Don't worry, it's not going to be like this all the way," shouted Anna over the noise of the engine. "It'll be smoother once we get away from the coast." Ollie was already looking uneasy and hanging on to Taya as if she was a magic talisman against seasickness or drowning. When we finally arrived, the sun had completely set and we cruised into the island's little natural harbour by the light of the moon. The water was luminescent with glowing plankton, every little ripple causing it to fluoresce a brilliant green. My stomach had held up fairly well, although Ollie had spent the past 2 hours retching over the side, even with the help of the travel sickness pills. The two men dropped us off on the island and immediately left again. "They're not going to at least take a break?" I asked. "Oh no," said Jude. "They've got work to do. Right, let me show you where we'll be spending the night." Jude led us to a spot high up on a beach, shaded by palms. I had no real sense of how big the island was or what else was on it, but the bit I could see indeed appeared paradisiacal. The sand was almost white and little red crabs scuttled about on it. The sea glowed green where the waves broke on the shore and the moonlight glittered on the water. The sky, which I was used to seeing from towns, now appeared like a rich tapestry of innumerable stars, as if fretted with golden fire, to quote Shakespeare. Jude set to work searching for wood to build a fire. "How many times have you been here before?" I asked Anna. "Here," she said. "Never." "I thought you'd all been here lots of times," I said, surprised. "No, we only met Jude a couple of weeks ago," she said. "He's the one who knows about the island." "A couple of weeks?" I said incredulously. "I thought you were old friends." "We all met a year ago," she said, "except Jude. He's new, like you." Taya was tending solicitously to Ollie, who was sitting cross-legged, looking rather green but grateful to be on the land again. "When life offers you an opportunity, you take it," said Ollie. "That's my philosophy." Jude reappeared with a bunch of sticks. "Right," he said. "Let's make a fire and crack open some beers. Tonight we eat bread, olives and cheese. Tomorrow we fish." That evening would probably have remained in my mind as one of the most memorable evenings of my life had it not been for subsequent events. Now I can hardly bear to think of it without feeling sick. Of course, I had no presentiment at all of what was to follow. We sat around a fire on the beach, toasting flatbread and goat cheese on sticks, drinking beer and watching the incredible phosphorescent waves under the light of a silver moon in a black sky thick with stars. I felt truly happy for perhaps the first time in years. Eventually we fell asleep on the warm sand. The next day Jude went off somewhere and fetched several fishing rods. He had some kind of cache of useful things somewhere a little bit inland at what he called his base. He showed us how to cast the lines out, standing up to our waists in the water. Incredibly, we actually managed to catch as many fish as we could possibly eat. We wouldn't be going hungry. We baked some of the fish wrapped in leaves in the sand under a fire. They were delicious, although in fairness I was very hungry, since there wasn't much else to eat, apart from coconuts. Jude began to make a kind of thick soup or stew for later, using the rest of the fish, along with some ingredients from his cache and some things he'd found on the island. "I can't wait," said Ollie, sniffing the stew appreciatively. "You just ate 2 enormous fish," said Taya. "Sure I did, but it smells delicious," said Ollie. "You won't be disappointed," said Jude. "My fish stew is the best for miles around." He made a sweeping gesture with his arm, and Anna began to laugh. "There is no one else for miles around," she said. We all laughed with her, including Jude. "If there was anyone else here," said Jude, "they'd love my stew, trust me." At some point, Anna, who was taking an interest in the preparation of the stew, noticed that Jude was adding some kind of a sea snail, winkled out of a spiral shell. "Does that really have to go into it?" she said, wrinkling her nose. "It looks disgusting." "This is the best part," said Jude. Jude simmered the stew for hours. He left it simmering in a pot while the 4 of us explored the island a bit. There wasn't a lot of it, but it was beautiful. On the west side, steep cliffs were covered with all kinds of strange plants and birds. The middle of the island was thickly forested, but there were clear trails leading through the forest. By the evening we were all very hungry, and we started to press Jude to serve the stew up. Apart from some coconuts and bits of dried out bread, there was nothing else to eat. Eventually, as the sun was setting, he announced that it was ready. "Prepare yourselves for the culinary experience of your lives," he said solemnly, dividing the stew carefully between 5 wooden bowls. We all agreed that the stew smelt delicious. It was shaping up to be another spectacular night of fresh fish, fire, stars, luminous sea and laughter, I remember thinking. I began to feel a little weird even while I was still eating it, working my way through a second bowl. My tongue and throat began to tingle at first, then they began to feel numb. I remember feeling a kind of heaviness in my limbs and chest. "Does anyone else feel weird?" said Taya, echoing my thoughts. "Some of the herbs I used in the stew make some people feel tired," said Jude. "The best thing to do is lie down for a bit and digest it. Try to sleep. You'll wake up in an hour feeling amazing." We did actually take his advice, or at least we lay down on the sand. The conversation started to take a dark turn. Ollie started saying he couldn't breathe. I said I felt like my chest was really heavy and I had pins and needles in my feet. Only Anna said nothing. She had apparently fallen asleep, tired from the day's exertions. Taya's, Ollie's and my symptoms worsened over the next half hour. We were becoming seriously alarmed. Jude frowned. "Must be some kind of allergic reaction," he said. "Are you sure the soup was okay?" said Taya. "Of course," said Jude. "I ate it too and I'm fine. Seriously, you all just need to sleep it off." "I feel horribly dizzy," said Taya. "Me too," said Ollie. I tried to sleep, but sleeping is hard when you're starting to feel like you're gasping for air. Nevertheless, I did fall asleep, or perhaps I fell unconscious, I'm not sure. I definitely remember that by the time I ceased to be aware of my surroundings, I was in enough distress that I would have called an ambulance if emergency services had been available. The last thing I can remember before passing out is the sound of Taya's alarmed voice, complaining that her body felt numb and her heart was pounding. When I awoke, it was completely dark. At those latitudes, the transition from dusk to night is very fast, so I had no idea if 10 minutes had passed or hours. I was able to open my eyes only with a huge effort to gaze upon a vast starry expanse above. I couldn't detect any sign of the fire that Jude had been cooking on, nor did anyone else seem to be around. With rising alarm, I realised I was so weak that I could not turn my head, and even though I was hungry for air, I couldn't manage to take a deep enough breath to satisfy the craving. I tried to shout, but no sound came out. I seemed to be almost completely paralysed. I couldn't even feel my legs or my arms. My heart raced weakly. I tried to reason with myself. I had heard, of course, of the pufferfish, which contains a paralysing poison, and the blue-ringed octopus, which may paralyse a person with a bite. Were either of these present in Morocco? I didn't know. It seemed pretty clear that I had either eaten something poisonous or else had been bitten by some venomous creature. The others must have gone for help. I told myself that I must remain calm. Help would arrive in time. Exactly how long it would take for help to arrive, I didn't want to think. As I lay there, with my frantic thoughts bubbling over each other in a singularly peculiar manner, I realised suddenly, with horror, that waves were lapping around my shoulders. The tide was coming in and would soon submerge my face. Again I tried to shout, but it was hopeless. It was all I could do to keep breathing. I tried to turn my head to the side so that I could gain a better view of the situation. With enormous effort, I managed to twist my neck slightly, enough to gain a view of the beach, although my vision seemed blurred. I could make out two shapes a little distance away, slightly further down the shoreline. The realization hit me all at once that these shapes were two human bodies, and the sea was lapping over their mouths. I couldn't tell for sure who they were, but my guess was that they were Taya and Ollie. I was overcome with sheer terror, and a faint noise emerged from my mouth, a pitiful, muted sound of fear and despair. Were it not for the effect of whatever I had ingested, it would have been a blood-curdling scream, but instead I made only a sound that someone sitting 10 meters away would have struggled to detect. At that moment, a wave filled my mouth with salty water, and I began to gurgle and cough, but all with the utmost weakness and lack of control. I somehow managed to swallow the water, with perhaps half of it going right into my lungs, and move my head back to face the sky. I calculated I had perhaps 10 or 20 minutes before the waves cut off my air and filled my mouth. There was nothing I could do. I wondered what it would be like to drown. I told myself that perhaps I would only suffer a minute of pain and air hunger before succumbing to unconsciousness. Please God, not more than a minute. A wave washed up against my chin. More water fell into my mouth, and I began to choke again. Then hands seized my shoulders and dragged me up the beach. "Thank God you're alive," said a voice. It was Anna. "Oscar, oh thank God." I could make no reply. "Taya and Ollie are dead," she said. "They're dead." She was sobbing hysterically, pulling herself together well enough only to speak with a huge effort of will. "They drowned," she said. "Jude poisoned us, Oscar. That snail thing he put in the soup. I knew I'd seen it somewhere. I spat it out secretly because I didn't want to eat snails. When I woke up I found Ollie and Taya dead and Jude gone. I thought you were dead too." I couldn't speak and water was bubbling out of my lungs with every breath, but I smiled weakly and insincerely, trying at least to show her that I was grateful to her. I didn't actually expect to live much longer, even though she had saved me from the water, but realising my lungs were full of water, she turned me on my side and I reflexively coughed a lot of it out. "We've got to hide," she said, and she began to drag me into the trees. That night was hellish. I constantly expected to become unable to breathe at any moment, but Anna kept talking to me in a hushed whisper, encouraging me to fight for my life. Not until about an hour before sunrise did I finally perceive that the drug was wearing off. My breathing was becoming less laboured, and I was able to make small movements with my fingers. When the sun came up, I began to worry that I'd die of thirst. I couldn't drink in the condition I was in, not even with Anna's help, but the drug began to rapidly subside as the sun warmed the air. First I began to be able to turn myself over, and then, with Anna's help, to sit up. I don't believe anyone has ever felt a greater sense of relief than when I felt I could sit up against a tree and weakly move my arms around. I managed to gasp out a few words. "Why did he do this?" I said. "Money," said Anna. "He took their money and their passports. Yours is gone too. I expect he'll sell the passports. That's why he told us to bring extra money. There are no diamonds. He was just going to steal it all." I made a noise which didn't manage to sound like any particular word, but I think adequately conveyed my opinion of Jude at that point. "Too right," said Anna. I slept for a bit during the morning, and when I awoke I felt much stronger. I was able to briefly stand with Anna supporting me, before sitting down heavily again. "The question is, what are we going to do?" she said. "Those fellows are due to come back with the boat today, aren't they?" I said. "They must be in on it," she said. "Otherwise they'd raise the alarm when we don't turn up. They'll kill us if they find us." I sat against a tree, digesting this idea. "None of this makes any sense," I said. "What kind of psychopath would do this? It must have been an accident." "If it's an accident, how do you explain that Jude's missing and our stuff's gone?" said Anna. "Maybe we got bitten by something and he thought we were all dead and he took our stuff so he could take it to the police," I suggested. Now that I'm telling you this, it sounds hopelessly naive, but I was probably still suffering from the effects of the drug, and Jude just didn't seem like the sort of person who'd do such a thing. "No, he poisoned the soup," said Anna. "He poisoned it deliberately, I'm sure of it. Why would he assume I was dead when I was just asleep? He thought I was paralysed and dying because he thought he'd poisoned me. It's the only thing that makes sense. Perhaps he found Taya and Ollie and just panicked and jumped to the conclusion that we were all dead," I suggested. "I saw him eat the stew. It couldn't have been poisoned." "You thought you saw him eat it," said Anna. "He sure as hell didn't actually eat it. I don't know if he secretly spat it out like I did, or if he had an antidote, but I'm quite sure that soup was deliberately poisoned." We got into a debate about whether Jude could have poisoned the fish stew deliberately. Anna was adamant that he'd done exactly that, while I just refused to believe it. Eventually she came up with an idea. She proposed feeding the stew to Jude to see what would happen to him. "I've still got a bowl of it," she said. "I hid it before I went to sleep. I was going to tip it out somewhere." "You mean you know where he is?" I said. "Yes," she said. "He's about 10 minutes down the main path through the forest. He's got a little hut. I found him while you were sleeping." "We can't poison him," I said. "You said the soup's not poisonous," she said. "You said you saw him eat it. Either he ate it and it's not poisoned, or he's immune to it, or else he did poison it and he didn't eat it. Either way, feeding it to him will be completely ethical. He's got a pot of something fishy he's boiling up down there. We only have to slip in a bit of soup." I struggled in my groggy state to get my head around the ethics and logic of the whole idea. In the end, I agreed to it, on the basis that it'd prove him innocent. A kind of trial by fish soup. The fact is that I didn't know Anna any better than I knew Jude, and for all I know, she was completely paranoid. It was true that Jude had made a show of eating the soup. If that soup was poisoned, he must have taken an antidote, or spat it out when we weren't looking. There was no other explanation. And if he had spat it out, didn't that indicate guilt? Anna had done the same thing, but she hadn't made the soup, nor had she been the one telling us to eat it in the first place. Perhaps I'm trying to justify myself. If Jude had poisoned me, I wanted him to get a dose of his own medicine. Perhaps that's the truth of it, and the real reason I went through with it. We found Jude exactly where Anna said he would be, sitting and chopping at something with a machete. He had a little shack made out of thin tree trunks, leaves and mud, and he was tending to what seemed to be another fishy concoction. We watched him for half an hour. Then, when he happened to go into the hut to fetch something, Anna nipped across and tipped her bowl of last night's stew into the pot. If he eats the whole thing, he'll probably get a quarter of the dose of what you had, she said breathlessly when she returned. Then we sat and waited. Sure enough, about an hour later, Jude did eat the soup, and within less than an hour after that, he began to stagger and flop about, clearly under the influence of some toxin. We waited till he appeared to be lying inertly on the ground before we approached. His eyes widened when he saw us, and he tried to rise to a sitting position, but he fell back to the ground. Then his hand groped for the machete, which he'd been using to whittle a bowl out of wood. He grasped it, but he couldn't seem to lift it. "I thought you were dead," he wheezed. His face betrayed unmistakable signs of guilt. "Yeah," said Anna. "Well, we're not." "You've poisoned me," he said. "It's your own fish stew," said Anna. "You've poisoned yourself." She turned to me and said, "Let's have a look in his hut." In the hut, in a metal box, we found our money and our passports. Shockingly, and very unexpectedly, at least to me, we found 12 other passports in there too. "I know this girl," she said, looking at one of the passports. "She went missing last year. She's Spanish." Suddenly she froze. "Listen," said Anna. We could hear a boat approaching in the distance. "They'll kill us," I said. "We have to go around them and get to their boat before they reach him," said Anna. We made off down the fork in the path that led to the little harbour, moving as quietly as possible. Fortunately, the men were arguing loudly about something. When they got close to us, we dove into the trees and hid while they went past. One of them had an automatic rifle. "Why would a fisherman have a gun like that?" said Anna. "We have to get out of here," I said. We ran to the harbour, taking the passports with us. When we got to the boat, we untied it and managed to start the engine. I thanked my lucky stars it was a simple outboard motor and not something more complicated, nor did it need a key. It took us a day and a half to make it back to the Moroccan coast. Neither of us had much experience of boats, and we nearly ran the thing aground on rocks. But in the end we managed to scramble ashore, perhaps 20 miles from the port where we'd departed. From there, one of the locals drove us to a police station. The police there seemed bored and uninterested till we showed them the passports. Then they burst into activity and began making phone calls. The police found the 2 men still on the island. Their houses were searched and 3 more passports were found, along with cameras and jewellery. They're currently awaiting trial, and it's expected that they'll receive death sentences for their complicity in the murder of over 19 tourists, although Morocco has not actually carried out any death sentences since 1993. As for Jude, he wasn't so lucky. By the time the police found him, he was dead. It may be that the men panicked and smothered him, or perhaps he proved to be unusually sensitive to his own poison. We'll never know for sure. Thank you for listening. My name's John and you've been listening to Science Horror. All the stories on this channel are written by me, John Purcell. If you like this story, please click the like button and do consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you so much. I try to get at least one story out every week, usually on Monday. And next week I've got a story for you about a journalist who follows a trail of murders in the Alps, only to uncover a horrific secret at the end. Do join me again for that. Until next time, sleep well.